8 out of 10 times. What it does is averages a single-family home and that impervious surface area, and uses that as a base measurement for every impervious surface in the city. So you have single-family, two-family, and three-family homes paying slightly different fee. And the single-family home represents 1 ERU. The ERU can then be applied to any property where it's impervious surface by dividing the impervious surface by the amount of the average footage of the ERU, the single family. So it's a very simple formula. We found it to be fair and equitable. It is, like I said, used 80% of the time when you set up a stormwater fee. And we felt that without presenting that to you as an option, we wouldn't be doing our task. It's simple in that it's very easy to explain. It's already measured. These measurements are essentially, I'm sure Ned, you can confirm this, or Jim, we have these numbers for this area, so that the build up, the lead up into this, and actually starting to get some bills out would be less time consuming. And I don't know what I'm leaving out. It's pretty directly described in the report. The only thing that's not typical in an ERU is what we've created as an undeveloped parcel fee. This was with the intent to include everyone in the city who owns property to contribute something, even if there's no impervious surface there. And so that's an arbitrary fee set on 1 ERU per 10 acres, and then prorated up and down from there. And we felt as a task force that was important to include everyone, in that they would all pay of some sort. So, and you can see how it breaks down: single family, two family, three family.
Greg, just one question that Dan mentioned is what's the breakdown of the ERU between residential property and the rest of the property? What would be the breakdown? I know we mentioned about that.
Yeah, there is a table in here. I believe it's 49%.
That's the point. Okay.
49.
That was
Commercial and other tax exempt properties. Or there might be a small percentage to the undeveloped, but 49.
Thank you.
All right.
If you look on 12 and 13 of this report, you can again see a list of the pros and cons for this model. And keeping with our thinking practice, is there anybody on the committee that would like to make a comment about either of those models that hasn't been made in the two presentations? Has anybody got any commentary or thoughts? The next section, Alex has to.
I just make it clear that the committee very overwhelmingly supported the hydraulic.
Yeah.
We might do the appendix next, is that right?
Sure, yeah, well, that says other considerations, and so then we have a list of appendices. I guess we don't need to go over the charge, we've got part of that on the board here.
Can we have Chris talk a little bit about credits and?
Yeah. Chris,
Whenever you're ready.
we're ready.
One of the things that we did as
I'm a keeper of the card.
oh, sorry, Chris Hellman, Board of Public Works. One of the things that we did as we looked at how this might happen was we looked at what other communities had done before us. And what we found almost universally, without regard to how they did it, was this idea that if you do the right thing, you can reduce what it is that you want to do. Some communities looked at it very holistically as regard to, what off-flow was going to be, that kind of thing. Other communities looked at it as how you might participate. But basically, it came down to 3 different kind of categories. One was, are you going to reduce the amount of water that goes into the system? Are you going to reduce the quality of the water that goes into the system, which is, in certain communities, a very important thing. And finally, how we as individuals might participate in doing this. My interest in getting into this was the bottom end, which is how do we, as a participatory community, which is what Northampton is, how do we provide incentives for people to buy into what is going to be a fairly vigorous, if we have our way, a fairly vigorous change in either the tax structure or the way we do things? How do we be part of this system, whether it's water barrels or that kind of thing? So I looked at, and I'm not making, and we did not make any recommendations with regard to how one might follow this. But I think what we came to as a group was this idea that we want to have a buy-in. We want to have a buy-in, and it goes beyond what it is that the law already requires. And one of the things we found is that the law already requires an awful lot. It absolutely does. And Jim and Ned can talk to you about what new construction requires, and people on the planning board can talk to you about what new construction requires. And one of the things that we had to try to balance, and I would have to say did not do successfully, is how do you balance credits for things that you're already legally required to do, as opposed to things you might go back and do? Because the new construction treats you differently than where you are currently. My house is, for instance, 150 years old. Not going to be doing any new construction. But what might I do? So I think in the short term, and what I think the committee came to the conclusion was, we don't know what the answer is, but we want to provide a series of incentives for people to buy into. And they could be simple, or they could be complicated. And we looked at, for instance, a 40-page report that came out of Ohio that was really intricate, and something that, as a group, we could never formulate. You'd have to buy in, and bring in consultants who would do that kind of work about how it might work, and it had to do with runoff and blah, 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 and a lot of what you heard of. But the point was, we as a community can think about how we as individuals and as a group might mitigate the circumstances of what it is that we're trying to do. At the end of the day, what it really boils down to is how much we're going to flush and how we're going to do it. And We didn't come to any conclusions on that. I have a lot of thoughts on my own. I think the committee has a lot of thoughts on it. But at the end of the day, one of the things that I think we collectively agreed to was this idea that if you want to buy in, if you want to encourage buy-in to what is going to be a substantial new, format of leveraging fee, whatever you want to call it. One of the things you might want to propose is, a buy-in where I can buy off $5, $2, $3, whatever it is, because it's going to reduce the overall problem that we have, and it's going to encourage the kind of participatory incentive that this kind of community really, really thrives on. So.
Jim?
Yeah, I'm Jim Dostal, and stormwater has been my forte for years. It was my charge when I worked for the city, and this particular report has done one heck of a job on what we have to do to get our hands around this problem. The budget of $2 million is a great budget, and I know it's realistic. Ned has gone through the figures, and Jimmy, and they've looked at what we need to do for the next year or two, and it's a good budget. My problem is it may not be enough. What do we do? I have made a statement that we've got to put a cap on this, and in the report you'll find that there's a cap, excuse me, proposed of cost of living, or possibly tie it to a cap of 2.5. Now, if you, and put a sunset clause in this. Let's put the cap in, put the sunset clause in, and look at this in 3 to 5 years and see if the money that we're raising is going to be the kind of money that is going to do something realistic in this. If it isn't, then certainly another method has to be looked at. Now, if you do put a cap in, and you have a catastrophic problem in the stormwater system of $100,000 or $250,000 that happens within the city, that is going to go directly back to the city council for funding out of the general fund. And it'd be an emergency. We don't, if we cap this, we don't have the money in the fund to tackle that kind of expenditure. So just be realistic about it. That's it.
So, I'm glad you're up. I'm not sure if this is the right place to ask this question, but I haven't seen where it would fit in. And Mr. Dostal, he maybe personally remembers this, which is, how much of the current structure that we have, whether it's dams, a pumping station, did we get funding in the past to build those from the state or federal government? And was there ongoing money for that?
No. It was built in 1940 and was handed to the city and said, here, you operate it and you pay for it.
And was it funded through
Through the federal government.
through the federal government?
Yes. Corps of
And
Engineers.
other things that were funded and that you know about from that time on by federal government or state
Not for
government?
stormwater that I know of. That was the only thing. And there was no maintenance funding of it. So all of the maintenance, the city has picked up for the years. And, we've put a new diesel engine in the flood control station. We have 2 gasoline engines in there now that are Sterling engines. They're 1940 manufactured. You can't buy parts for them. And if one breaks down, yeah, you could probably manufacture a part, but you can't manufacture a part before the rainstorm. That's the thing, or in the middle of the rainstorm. So really, you have to have equipment that is reliable. We have to look at this whole thing.
Can I just ask one follow-up on that? And the dams, when they were first built, who paid for this?
Dams, that I gotta refer to Ned and Jimmy.
Are you talking about the dams or the levee system? Flood
Levy
control?
system, or
All
levy
done at the
system.
same time.
Yeah, same
Done at
time.
the same time, paid for by the federal government, yes.
Yeah.
If I could just quickly, to his point, the federal government came to the city and offered to build it if we would assure them that we would maintain it. In early November of 1938, the city council passed a resolution authorizing Mayor William Fiker, giving him the authority to sign those assurances with the, in a document that was signed jointly by the city and the Army Corps of Engineers. We assured the federal government that we would maintain it in perpetuity if they would build it. That's the deal we made in November of 1938.
That's right.
You remember that, Jim?
Yeah, Jim would.
He was a kid then,
At 38, I was just a little boy.
There was no sunset clause on that?
but no.
No. My question, somewhere in here, I read it, you talked about the phasing in of the fee over a period of several years. How much discussion went around that? And what was the impetus behind that
Well,
particular?
phasing in, I'm not sure of whether there could be really any phasing in. But after you raise $2 million, which is a necessary figure, then over a period of years, you can go up on the fee. But again, we want to limit it. That's why the sunset clause, and that's why to take a look at it in 3 to 5 years. Are you doing what you intend on doing? And you have a hand up in the back of the room there.
I do. Again, Chris Hellman, part of the discussion. I think one of the things that Jim and I agree on is that we need the money now. Now, right now. Because there are things coming down the road through EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers about which we don't get to make decisions. They are coming. And the phase-in portion of the discussion was based on this idea that we wanted to avoid sticker shock. But I think if you ask Jim, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I've heard you say this. He doesn't like the phasing, and I'll tell you why. We need the money frickin' yesterday. Okay? We made some calculations in our discussions that you guys, as elected officials, will have the luxury of making that we just sort of dipped our toe in, which is how palatable this is all going to be. It's not going to be palatable at all. It's not going to be. And that's why we talked about a phase-in. But I think the number crunchers like me who looked at this and said 2 million, 3 million, whatever the hell it is, it's a down payment on a really big number. Okay, so we don't know what that number is going to be. It was not our mandate to figure out what that number was going to be. What our mandate was, how do we find a way to pay for it that would be equitable and fair and smart? We used 2 million as sort of a target number, but I don't think any of us really thought that 2 million was the number. What we wanted to do was come up with a way to spread the burden amongst the community in a way that made sense. And it would be up to you guys, and I love you, Dan, and it would be up to you guys our elected officials to figure out how to implement our strategy or some other strategy in a way that made sense.
Thank you, Chris. Harrison?
Just one second. The reason for my question was that actually it was around the fact that we need the money right away. And that, well, when I saw that the phasing in of the fee over several years, that was why I asked the question.
It seems to me that, as Jim explained, is that the purpose of having a sunset clause would be to reevaluate after a period of time for raising the necessary money to get to be where we need to be. I have a concern that's on the opposite end of that, which is if it expires after 3 years, at that point there would be no limitation to how much the fee can go up year after year. And I think that the general public would like some assurance that this would not be at all like the water and sewer fees, which have gone up substantially over the past several years. So it would be my hope that we can come up with a type of mechanism that would allow for a cap, but if we need to supersede that cap, built into the mechanism would be another way of superseding the cap.
That is your charge.
Yeah, I have some ideas exactly on that,
Yeah.
so I'm happy to look.
You got it.
Dan Felton?
I,
No, Dan.
oh, sorry.
You're next,
Go
Bill.
ahead.
Sure. Just to respond to Gene's question. That question came up at the end of the task force of whether to do a phased-in approach. That's a political discussion, but that was the reason why we're discussing it, is to phase it in to allow people to get used to this rather large fee that would be coming down, particularly, there's going to be, I think, some commercial property owners that are going to be stunned with the fees they're going to get. In response to what Chris was saying, I think we actually discussed quite a bit the budgetary amount. $2 million was reiterated on a number of occasions as being a reasonable budget amount. Terry said that will seem like a, plus or minus, but that we were not looking at a large range of 1 to 4 million. It's going to be somewhere around 2 million. And I think that, all of our discussions and the minutes reflect, I think, a $2 million being a reasonable budget. And the purpose of a cap on an annual basis was to actually limit the amount that it can go on, whether it was a cost of living, a consumer price index, or a 2.5, whatever you decide, that there would be a way, because one of the discussions that could come up is this fluctuating cost that could impact the annual fee. And numbers of $4 to $6 million a year of fluctuation were discussed, and the task force had a very strong reaction to that proposition and felt that that could not in any way be part of the formula, that there needs to be start with 2 million, gradually increase. If you have a major expenditure, it's going to have to be done through some sort of bonding that would not stockpiling money for some rainy day. And that was, I think, a really unanimous opinion of the task force.
I think some of us were building moats around our houses. We proposed this.
Bill?
Just a question.
Can you just?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm Bill Dwight, council president, and actually not a member of any of these task forces. Just a general question. If someone could speak historically about how maintenance, deferred or otherwise, has been subsidized since 1930, because that's certainly going to come up in the course of the conversations we take our case to the public. They're going to want to know, well, how the hell has it been covered before that? So I'd even defer to the august Mr. Dawson. Well,
Jim did it all.
Jim, he retired.
Francis is director of the.
I think we refer to net in the budget. You want to comment?
Sure. As far as, excuse me, as far as flood control, the only thing that's supplemented on the sewer enterprise fund is on overtime working the flood control station. There's only an overtime budget, personal services for overtime, not straight time budget. So the wastewater treatment plant has all the flood control operators. So that enterprise fund picks up the straight time that they're initially on for their first 8 hours of flood control. I can-
The stormwater fund.
There is no stormwater.
I'm sorry, the wastewater fund.
That's correct.
My apologies.
For the first 8 hours, and then the overtime kicks in out of the flood control budget, which is a general site budget. I've been with the city for 13 years, and I have not seen flood control change in 13 years of budgeting. The personal services is set at $13,000 a year, and the O&M, I believe, is about $40,000 a year. For fuel, any expenses that occur down there, that parts and pieces of machinery that might need to be fixed or rebuilt and so on. As far as stormwater, it's always been on the general fund. If we had a project like Crescent Street or Ridgewood Terrace, we went to the city council for an appropriation for it. There's never been a true fund. Actually, I take that back. 4 years ago, as part of one of our budget cuts, we had an annual line item of $62,000 a year coming into the stormwater side. That was cut as part of a budget cut. It was never reinstated. So about every 4 or 5 years, we were able to accumulate about $250,000 that we could take on a drainage project, a street project, or something of that nature. Versus the enterprise funds, we dedicate about $400,000 a year for water and sewer line replacements. And that's one of the things that we're missing, is that on the stormwater side, there is no funding mechanism unless the city council appropriates money for capital improvements.
And for large projects, bonding, low interest loans from the federal government, state?
The only thing that we've been able to secure, or we haven't even secured it yet, is working on FEMA grants, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They have a flood mitigation program that you can apply for projects like bank stabilization projects, the River Road retaining wall that's falling in, we've applied for that. It's a 75% reimbursable, but the city still needs to come up with 25% of the value of the construction costs and engineering. Those are the only supplemental funds that we've been able to find to date, and they are competitive with the 351 communities across the Commonwealth.
MJ.
I think that Dave Teese wanted to.
I'd like to make 2 points. Regards to the budget.
For the record, it's David Teese.
David Teese. In regards to
Tape recorder doesn't pick up your side.
this committee had nothing to do with the budget. It was not prepared by us. We used it as a reference point. It was given to us. That number was given to us. We take no ownership of this budget. We did continually use the figure that was given to us, but we were told very clearly at the beginning that we had nothing to do with that budget. It was not part of our charge. And while the $2 million was talked about multiple times, and we agreed that it was this or that, it is not part of this committee's charge. I personally take no ownership of that budget. I do want to talk about it at a future time, but today is not the time for us to talk about it. That's the first point. To Councilor Adams, one of the questions was, and Alex in his report said that there are 500 to 600 towns in the 500 to 600 municipalities in the nation that have a stormwater or enterprise fund. And there are 5 or 6 in this state. 2 of them have already come back because they did not ask for enough money when they started. So 1/3 of the cities in this Commonwealth have found that when they came out and asked for first was not enough. I just want that point.
Chris?
And I don't know when I'm going to get a chance to speak again, but I think it's important to point out that, and something Emery said early when we were looking for an extension of our deadline, this wasn't, our inability to come up with something about which we were happy had nothing to do with a lack of work. We got really smart over the last, 2 months, 3 months, and we had a lot of help. Fred, kept us honest on a level that I can't even begin to imagine. And his name will not show up in the formal report, but I will never forget his input. I came into this with 3 things that I thought were important. One was everybody was going to pay. The other was, I can't remember, but the whole point was that this was going to be something where we were talking about what I like to phrase participatory democracy. That there was going to be a buy-in where we all got a part of it. It's not going to be an easy sell. We're asking people to do something that they don't want to do. We have to convince them that it is not a good thing. This isn't a luxury item. This is freaking essential. That's the point. And how we're going to do that as a group is going to be complicated. Because we're going to ask people, and you know, I gotta say, $100 a year, it ain't gonna skin my butt, but it's gonna make a difference for other people in the community in which I live. And I've got to explain to them why it's important to them, why this has to happen. And it's not like when you turn on the water, you know how much you use, or when you flush the toilet, you know how much goes out the door. It has to do with what makes our community a better place.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Can I pull to the committee and ask Mike to go ahead?
Yeah, mine's sort of smaller world scale, but both models that have been proposed required data from the DPW or the assessors to make them work. And I wanted to hear from the staff about whether or not that data is available, readily available, or if we have to do work to generate it.
The work is pretty readily available. I think the task force had asked us whether the models that were proposed were implementable, and I think we said that they definitely, both of them are. Data is sort of in a state of flux. We rely on some GIS data that we get from the Commonwealth of Mass, which is in the process of being updated, but the data is readily available.
It seemed like the difference between the two models was the need to measure pavement on the hydraulic model, and that's available from GIS.
I mean, there's some work that's involved, Mike, but pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I just want to speak to the general purpose of the appendix. I mean, you've heard a lot of summary stuff here, but there's a lot of good information in this appendix. So for those of you who haven't read it, there's our charge, which was great. We've got an article on the front page of the paper about this problem. Raise public awareness. It's going to be a real problem if this moves forward, to let people know why this has to happen. So I really encourage the City Council, BPW, to do all the outreach and education they have. Terry's a wonderful ambassador, but it really has to become part of the public discussion. You know, we did look at, like Dan said, 9 different models. We really struggled with equitable and transparent. Because these are not simple things to decide. A couple things we found. The data the city has is pretty good, not perfect. We saw a chart that had state and federally owned properties that had mass Audubon lines. So there are problems with the data that's available from the assessor's office. So whichever system gets put in place, people are going to have to look at what's classified how, and really with a careful eye. You can't just take the assessor's word for it, because even she makes mistakes. There's also, you see also in the appendix is a list of all the city and state and federal properties which we've recommended be excluded. They are substantial. You know, there were people on the task force who said that we should figure out a way to figure in the commons, which is what my name for it was, and we decided not to do that. But this is a real, when you take out all the city and federally owned and all the parking lots and schools, that's a lot of impervious surface. So that's one of the failed models attempted to look at that problem. Also in here is good description, detailed descriptions of Dan's and Rick's models, the hydraulic acreage and the ERU models, all the letters that set this up. And at the end is David Teese's statement. And there were some big skeptics among us, among them David Teese and Ruth McGrath, I'm sure, and some other people. So David, are you interested in reading your statement to the group? You want to do that? That'd be great.
Thank you. I'd like to also acknowledge Ruth came in late. She was our cinematographer for all of our meetings.
I apologize, I had a family emergency.
I'm pointing out that you were late, just said you were our cinematographer. Thank you for letting me read this. I hope that what this is part of the spirit of what the committee was, and some of it is in my words. And I'm already sweating, so I'll be sweating a little more. I'm a graduate of Williston Academy, and I've lived in Florence for 38 years. I've been a journeyman plumber for 34 years, and a master plumber for 22 years. I have owned Northampton Plumbing Supply for 27 years. My wife Kathy and I have been married for 34 years, and we have 3 adult children. You and me and rain on the roof. It started with a call to serve on a task force to talk about stormwater and flood control. At this time, there was no final charge yet from the Northampton City Council. Meeting with a group of interested citizens for a task force discussion normally would raise a red flag for me because of the fear of meandering conversations and lack of clarity to an end result. Usually I take a cynical view of what or whose end goal would be the final objective. Unfortunately, such fears and cynicism often lead to a negative start with negative energy, and I quickly found myself in this mindset during the first 2 meetings. The charge was not initially presented, and the timeline for due diligence not realistically set. There was initial sidetracking of any progress towards a common end. Since we were a task force with no history, this was not surprising, but was very frustrating to me and other members of the task force. My frustration left me in disagreement with many ideas. These frustrations hindered me from seeing progress towards our goals as they developed. As the group matured, I noticed a lack of ego from others in the meetings and quickly realized that once I too checked my ego at the door, all ego ceased to exist during the meetings. There was talk of common area, common use, and common good. There was also talk of facts, figures, pervious and impervious surface, runoff coefficients, budgets, nonprofits, and tax-exempt status. There was a tsunami of critical information. Upon first reviewing what the cost of this rain tax would be in my business, research was directed at how this would affect profit as I manage over 200,000 square feet of building and more than 6 acres of land and/or paid parking. How would this rain tax be funded through business activities? The charge was that the funds needed should be raised using a formula that was transparent, fair, and equitable. I was for all of these parameters unless I had to pay. Then our field trip to the flood control pumping station and the magnitude of what we have to deal with in real time became clear to me. Once the task force became focused on formulas and methodology, our efforts became more fluid and our group prospered. There are many parts of our presentation that will make some citizens unhappy. Unfortunately, this process has just started. The City Council will need help as they struggle with our methodology and the reasoning behind our recommendations. Our reasoning, however, is sound and thorough. We did a job and we reached consensus. While consensus is not always perfect, it aims to be fair. We will demand caps, oversight, and accountability on this additional fee for ourselves and our fellow residents. These are technical terms and they're all in our report. For the task force, our demands should be spoken of as recommendations or wishes. We wish that education on these issues becomes the highest priority. We wish there are some credits extended for storm management to increase education in this area. We wish that the common area is connected to the common good for the good of all. No person is an island. We are all far from that. No business can survive without the common good. No employees or customers will be able to get to work, to bank, to shop, or eat at restaurants without this good. Our public safety personnel will not be able to help anyone, as they will also be stranded. Stormwater and the rain you and I have on our roofs is all part of it. There are EPA rules, laws, and budgets to deal with. There are financial struggles that will create hardship for many families, residents, and property owners. There's also the catastrophic failure of our infrastructure that will happen if we are not prepared. We need to raise money for these preventative measures. What we are recommending is not a rain tax or a fee. It is a common betterment for the common good. I will watch, ask questions, and demand oversight. I do believe
that it needs to be supported for a collective benefit, and I will support it. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think that's a wonderful summation and brings us to a point where it feels like we've heard your presentation from the recommendations and findings, and I would welcome a motion that the joint committee accepts the findings and the recommendations report of the City of Northampton Stormwater Ad Hoc Council, Ad Hoc Advisory Task Force.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Thank you. So we need to move on and talk about what the next steps will be. But I do want to just again very publicly and robustly acknowledge and thank the members of the task force who really put your nose to the grindstone and worked through this, both the environmental and the other issues that are at play. I really appreciate the work. I also want to make sure that this document becomes a public document and will be available on the DPW website. Yes. So they're sort of nodding yes.
Well, it can be on the DPW website or on the city main page. So the city main page might be a little more appropriate, where it's more visible to people.
So it'll be made available, the whole report, and there are copies here that Jim has made available also. So, thank you.
Thank you.
And like the city council, when this, they had uttered it a few times, stormwater, had to do something with it, and I said enterprise fund, and we discussed it back and forth on several occasions. And then they decided the task force, and Ford was in my ward. You were the first name that came to mind, and I want to thank you for chairing. And I want to thank the entire effort. And the city council takes this very seriously. We know that we're going to need something. We will put our armor on when we present this to the public, because I know it's not going to be well received. And I want to thank everybody very much. And I'm glad you're not taking any credit for the budget part of it. That's a good move on your part. Thank you very much, everybody.
Councilor Lamarche, did you want to make a comment?
Thank you. I want to thank the task force. I want to thank David Teese, Ruth McGrath. At first, when I asked her, she was a little hesitant about being on it, and I said, you'll do fine. As a city councilor, I have to commend David Teese. I came to 2 meetings, and it became very difficult because of the Thursday evenings in city council. I have great concerns with the amount of residents that have attended this meeting. It has opened the doors for me as a city councilor to make sure that we get the word out, we communicate to the public. They need to be educated. It's extremely valuable. It is going to be coming out of their pockets, and it's for a good reason. I agree, Chris. I also feel as a city councilor, I'm not going to have an armor on. I'm going to be as respectful as can be to educate the public what that cost is going to be. That's what they need to hear. What is wrong here in the city? What we need to do for the Board of Public Works to move this project on. So, thank you, committee, for working hard.
Thank you, Councilor Labarge, for acknowledging the challenge that confronts us. It's a big frickin' deal. And we're gonna have to make a sales pitch that we are not currently positioned to make. This is not about how spiffy our town might be, or the way we might, paint stripes on the sidewalk. This is about what the government, in their grand scheme of things, has mandated that we do. Having spent some time thinking about what the federal government does, it's what we call an unfunded mandate. It's a pain in the ass, but there it is. And we have to acknowledge that it's out there, it's essential, and we've got to come up with the wherewithal to make it happen. We're lucky. We're lucky. There are communities that are going to be faced with the same challenges that we have, that don't have the wherewithal that we do.
Thank you, Chris. I think it's time for this committee to then move forward and make some decisions about next steps. Justin, if you want to.
Yeah, actually, since it's clarification, it has to do with working both from here and
It'll take a moment, but you're welcome to stay, but thank you so much. We really appreciate all the work that you've done, so thank you.
Our committee was powered by chocolate.
Yeah.
There you go.
I'm glad they were sitting by the air conditioner. Never get a lot of the rapper.
Harry Sinowitz used to bring chocolates to the DPW meeting. They almost broke her finger.
Well, what the heck? I need to keep my weight up.
I'm walking, I gotta talk to the reporter.
Take care. Sorry, Dad. That's how you do. I was doing
Let's go see David.
Thanks, Cheryl.
All right, now that the student masses
Put it on your wall at home and keep it as a memento of this. And relax.
Well, so we've been talking about what happens on Thursday. I have to tell you, speaking purely for myself, I would like to see it come up at the city council and have the city council then direct the joint committee or the board of public works or someone to keep working on this, not to let it sit. I think it's unreasonable to think that the council is going to have the time or perhaps even the energy to advance the thinking on this. It's not in any kind of a format where it's ready to be considered an ordinance. We have two competing models for divvying up the fee. They have to be resolved. There has to be some kind of a conference committee or an effort made to unify that into one methodology. There are credits to be looked at. There are, well, the whole thing, a lot of stuff has to happen before this is really ready, I think, for the city council to think of it in terms of their next steps. There's nothing you could refer to an ordinance committee, for example, at this point. So I would like the city council to touch it, thank the task force probably, and then refer it back to our group or to the Board of Public Works. And we can work on it through July and August.
Bill's wife left, I don't see him, it'd be hard to hide, but that was in our discussions with the council president, that is the process that we decided to do, and Jesse's written a short order to that effect. And I think we need to make clear a couple of things at the council meeting. It's not about looking at the details of the report, but rather, and number one, I think Jim is going to go ahead and thank this committee, because I, like you, think they did an amazing job. Individually, each person on that committee is going to get thanked. It's also important for a statement to be made that this is a process. The next step is grant a copy, refer it out. Then the public needs to know there will be public forums on this topic. We're not sure how many, but there will be a lot, and I agree with Councilor Marsh. We need to do the work as councilors to get people out there. So we need to acknowledge those things, thank the committee, and Jesse's written the order. So it's not at the council meeting. I totally agree. We're not prepared yet. We need your help to kind of hone this down, give us something in ordinance form, move it to public forum where it's crisper, cleaner, and we have what we are discussing in public sphere.
There's a lot of brainstorming that's going to have to happen here on just exactly how to go about the assessment, who is going to, and the bills that will go out, and I mean, just the mechanism to put this forward is going to be a lot of work. And I'm trying to think of just exactly how all this will go about. I know that the DPW, in my mind, is going to come up either with a recommendation or will set the rate. We don't know, do we know exactly how the rate will be set? But I mean, it's just, it's going to be difficult.
Jesse has an order written, I think.
Yeah.
But just that, really, to answer that, I think the recommendation is to say that they're going to recommend it about the council will vote on ultimately.
Okay, good.
But as far as just making concrete exactly what we're going to do here process-wise, I have an order that I hope this committee sponsors, and that's why I was presenting it. If I could just read it outright. It says, upon the recommendation of the Joint City Council Board of Public Works Conference Committee, order that City Council accept the attached report of the Stormwater Advisory, Stormwater Ad Hoc Advisory Task Force, and further, the Board of Public Works draft a proposed ordinance based on this report, so that it's very clear and ordered. This passes. That the Board of Public Works will work out the details, everything from all the things that we discussed, including that question. Maybe it'll come back to us, and then they'll draft it throughout the coming months, and then it'll come back to the council. And I think maybe at that point we'll focus more on process and how many forms,
So
what sort of outreach we're going to do.
We envision this as being a tax bill. They come from the assessor's office, is that correct?
No.
No.
It would be a fee similar to water and sewer. Yeah. And to the extent we can build on our current database of water and sewer customers, that the customer is necessary. Gene, I think to your question, which is a good one, I think that the DPW, is it DPW? The details will be worked out in the ordinance. We're being left to task with the politically charged questions. I mean, you might come back and say we need $6 million a year, but it's up to us to really look at that and say, you know, what's feasible here? I appreciate this report because they often use those words. There's also a political question here. What can be tolerated? Like, there's a level of discomfort, and then there's a level at which it doesn't matter what the DPW says, we may not be able to do that. Caps, I think those are going to be things that we need to decide. That's a political question. Phasing in, I think those kind of questions are going to be the harder, in some ways, the hard questions, we need to take those on, and we're going to take heat for it, no matter what we do. I think what, from the beginning, the part of the task force, when we all talked about it, was to actually take some of the public heat off of the DPW, to let a committee come up with this, to let you do the details of this, and that it really should be the city council that takes the heat on these things. Because I've been here long enough to watch you guys take a beating on a number of issues that I actually think the city council, it's our job, we're the ones dealing with the public, we're the ones they can vote in or out if they don't like the decision. And there were a number of things in the last number of years that I've been on it with Councilor LaBarge that I've just felt we should have taken that on. And that's what I feel here. The hardest decisions, or we're the ones doing those, but in terms of the details, we don't have the time, energy, or even the expertise. You might have some of it, but most of us don't.
Okay, just to speak to something you just said, there's no question, it's not as crisp as a water bill. We have to think of a way to structure this so it seems transparent, it seems fair, so that as much as possible it's a fee. So when you say it's a tax, I just ask you to think about this. A house on Round Hill Road could easily be worth $800,000. Maybe it's a half an acre. House down in Bay State might be $200,000. Same lot size, same building, and roof size. So we're saying we're looking for objective ways to measure stormwater runoff that don't penalize the people on Round Hill Road just because their property is more valuable. It's not a tax. As much as we can, we want to make it a fee where the amount you pay is commensurate with the type of property you have, the size of the property and its characteristics. So we're trying to be as objective as possible. For the city council, if I can just give you this other piece of information, it's gonna come up. People are gonna say, hey, there are 351 towns in Massachusetts. 6 have a fee, why do we have to be number 7? Why couldn't we be number 107? 207, really, I mean, why do we have to pave the way? I would ask you to bear in mind and think about this and maybe be ready to talk about it. A lot of this fee is driven by the cost of flood control. Now, it turns out if you look at how many levees in the state that the Army Corps of Engineers has built, only about 25 communities now are, like us, home to some kind of an Army Corps of Engineers levee system. We have one of the oldest ones in the state, it's one of the largest ones in the state. So suddenly, we're now maybe more like one out of 10 or 15 communities instead of 351. There are only a few other communities with a flood control works on the scale of what we have, and communities who happen to be on a large river. So we really are in kind of a unique situation. And I just offer that to you. It's, people are going to be saying, why do we have to be next? And I think we're in kind of a unique situation.
I would wonder if Ed is doing any work on those 4,000 extra people that we have in the city. And if we didn't have, we wouldn't be looking at this.
Being locked off the Village of Leeds.
You know, because anything under 25,000 is this doesn't fall into that anymore. Is that correct?
I'm not following your question.
If it was 25,000 people or less in the city,
Stormwater.
there is no
Oh.
mandate.
The EPA mandate would go away, but flood control would go away.
Flood control wouldn't go away, but the EPA mandate would go away.
We wouldn't be part of the MS4 system.
Right.
The MS4, which is what we're classified as.
Which is M and 4 S's.
Right.
There is no 4, it's just M, S, 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 S. I forget what it all stands for. Okay.
Well, most of the money is what, MS4.
Well, there's a combination. The budget broken out for the compliance with the new NIPD's permit coming, which is the EPA stormwater permit. And the other parts are going to be with flood control deficiencies we have with the Army Corps of Engineers.
Chris, did you want to say?
Well, yeah, I think that this was one of the most constructive processes in which I've ever been engaged, because it brought in a lot of thinking that I didn't have. We got a lot smarter. I think one of the things we have to recognize, though, is that a lot of this is going to be about sales. And, you know, we can say it over and over again, but I think that one of the things that, and we can't call on Jim and Ned to do all the legwork, but I think that as you guys develop the consensus about what the right outcome is, whatever that is, you need to fall on us as members of the task force as resources to do this kind of spokesperson kind of stuff that you're going to need, because it is not going to be an easy sell.
That raises a question that you're talking about, which is what's the process here? I'm not sure if you're talking about the consensus gets reached. My sense is the process will go like this. We have the order, it goes to the DPW, they come back with an ordinance. We're not going to reach consensus on the council. I hope we don't, because then it'll make the public forums a sham. The public forums are a way, and I hope you guys will show up at those, is a way to get the public involved. And we go, oh, well, you know.
Well,
then
as
at that point, we debate it and pass it.
as the official BPW representative on this committee, that makes me really uncomfortable, because the way you framed it was, you'll hand it to them and they'll come back. Bad. Gotta have something in that, somewhere in there.
Well, we need, Chris, we have to have something that we're working with. It can't be this. I'm not sure what I mean. It can't be this report, because this is fantastic, but it's not in a form that we can
introduce it to the public.
Absolutely agreed, and I think that the nature of what you got is a reflection of the problem that we tried to grapple with, which is there isn't 100% consensus about what's smart on this, and that you guys, as our elected officials, are going to have to make some really, really hard choices. We're here to help you make them, but we can't make them for you. Or let me rephrase that. We won't make them for you. But we are, I think, as a group, I mean, Ned and Jim, numbers, unbelievable. Could not have moved forward without them, regardless of what our options were. But
Chris, I don't think they're implying that the task force.
No, I agree.
The Board of Public Works is going to keep working on it.
I agree. And you know, I don't think we're walking away from it. I just think that there's gonna be a moment in time where you guys are gonna have to decide.
Oh, yeah. Right.
And we will then provide you with the intellectual infrastructure to help make that decision smart.
Thank you.
Jim?
I just want to say that I hear what you're saying, I appreciate that point. When it comes to the council for the final vote, it's not going to be a report on the ordinance. It's going to have to be a concrete policy. And that's why this order requests that they take that report and they craft a policy, they can come back to us, and there can be plenty of process. You know, there's going to be plenty of additional process. But when it comes back to us, we can take that ordinance and vote it up, down, or amend it, and then vote it up or down. But it does need to be in some other form other than just the report itself. So it does have to be in concrete. That's why I drafted this order.
Just thinking aloud, listening to Paul speak for a minute, what Perry was saying, I had sort of envisioned that when it goes back to the board, you need a draft ordinance. There are a number of political decisions, a lot of caps and some other things that need to be made. When the ordinance is drafted, it's almost like you can have options for the council to consider.
Placeholders.
Placeholders, yes, placeholders, for the input from the public, and you have public forums, that way, at least the ideas that they're there from the placeholders.
Yeah.
Are we done on this issue? Are we ready to wrap up in the?
Well, I actually, I believe 6 have to be ordinance. I have to be there to be a form, but also I actually do need an actual vote on this. So if I can read it again, or I'll just vote on it.
I move the
Does it say DPW or DPW?
Or,
So can you just read it again?
sure. Upon the recommendation of Joint City Council Board of Public Works Conference Committee, ordered that City Council accept the attached report of the Stormwater Ad Hoc Advisory Task Force, and further that the Board of Public Works draft a proposed ordinance based on this report.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Great. Let's move on. Now we get to talk about snow removal from private ways.
So I think you all got the memo I sent out. And Jesse asked for a couple of clarifications, just for those of you who didn't see his question, he had a couple of questions. First of all, he wondered how much we currently spend removing snow on private ways. I think that was your question.
Yes.
And the answer is $15,000, $17,000, something in that neighborhood. His second question was,
Which is 2%.
he questioned, I said in that memo I sent out that the cost of the survey and legal work for the accepting all the streets that we can is going to exceed $100,000. He was under the impression it would be way over 100. Where are we running on those 4 streets we've done so far?
We're running about 3,000 to 3,500 per street on average. It's in between there.
And we're talking projection of about 40 streets, 35
The DPW has viewed 43 streets, I think, at this point. We have we have 7 more to do on July 20th, which will wrap up all the private ways that have been petitioned.
So that's about 50.
No, there's 43-ish or 44, I forget. One of the two.
Total. Some we don't believe are
Right.
suitable candidates for.
So that will wrap up our public hearing process. Now, all those streets will probably be recommended for acceptance, I would imagine. So, but based on the, where the 15,000 comes from approximately is that it makes up about 2% of our highway system. And if we use our larger budgets of $800,000 a year for snow removal and take that percentage out, what it really comes down to. Last year we had a very mild year of 450,000. This year was a record.
But on the question of the cost, Jesse raised.
150,000?
Yeah.
So we're talking about, just trying to get the number of streets. So 3 streets you gave us the numbers, it's about 3,500 streets. We talking about 40 or are we talking, it sounds like we're less, probably less than.
Probably a little under 40, and $3,000 or $4,000 per street. 150-ish.
Right. And then I don't know what the legal fees are. I haven't seen those bills, those go directly to the mayor's office. These are survey fees. Produce the plans, and
When
research.
might we know about that? When might we see a first bill from?
Alan Sewell.
I don't see the bills from Alan Sewell. They don't come to my office.
Can we call Alan tomorrow, one of us,
Sure.
and get an idea of what he thinks this might cost? To do this?
You'd have to go through the mayor.
Okay.
We're not supposed to speak.
Ned, do you want to do that? Because we're not.
Sure.
Okay. That'd be great.
And just to be clear, the $15,000 to $17,000 is about 2% of the snow and ice
Yeah,
budget.
it's a rough backing napkin calculation is what it is.
Yeah, okay.
All right. So broad strokes, the issue, our situation is this. We either cease plowing, that's one solution, not a very attractive one. We accept the streets, as many as we can, which involves legal and survey fees. Or we put the issue to the voters in November, asking for their permission to continue plowing indefinitely. The advantage of putting it to the voters is it's over and done with, as I stated in the memo. The disadvantage is, if that measure doesn't pass, I imagine we'd have to stop. I mean, the voters would have spoken at that point. And so here we are in second week in November, saying to 470 households, sorry, you're out of luck. That's my fear. It doesn't seem like a viable thing to pin our hopes on.
If you put a ballot question together right now, after an override, after we talk about this stormwater, it is going to be a resounding no.
Especially if you read the
We will
language.
disenfranchise everybody.
Yeah, the language is awful.
So, I've been pushing this for a while, but I did read the language and read what it had to be. And I agree with you now, the stormwater is bad timing. So, I've been one, as you guys know, harping on this from day one. And also that it looks like over a 10 or certainly a 12, 15-year period, it'll be a financial wash. And then eventually we'll get more money back, at least it'll cover that. And the fact, so 3 things. The reason why I wouldn't put this on the ballot now, but one, I'm glad Jesse, and thank you for the work you've done putting this together. One is, I agree with Gene, I think it's a divisive issue coming up at election time. When we're going to be doing forums, we would have to do forums on this, we'd have to do education on this as well. And I think doing those 2 things simultaneously, I agree with you, Gene. I think that would be just an awful thing after an override just came down. I think it would be a very challenging thing to do. So that's one. Number 2, the language that would be in there. I thought that the language could have been, there was much more kind of poetic license in the language. It turns out there's not. And so the way that language is proposed. And the 3rd thing is something you brought up, which is that coming in November, you're right, we can't keep plowing. And so now we have people on a number of streets, 30, 35, 40, who will be very upset. And if we just happen to have a snowstorm like we did a few seasons ago on November 12th, well, I would say don't come to work that day, maybe leave the state for a while.
Yes, my question is, I really don't agree about putting it on the ballot. And my reasons is because the city right now is accepting streets. You're out there with your engineers and accepting them. So how many have you accepted already? and how many you have not. That's what I'm hearing from people also, okay? So you are out there accepting streets and not accepting. Putting it on the ballot, I think it's a very bad time to be thinking about doing that. I'm having enough of problems on my ward right now between the Prop 2.5, which was high in the number against that override, and now hearing about the stormwater utility fee. They're outraged for that. I just think don't place it on the ballot. It's gonna cause a problem.
So, if it passed, well, if it passed, and if we started in Stone High School, that would mandate that we certain other maintenance, right? But whereas.
No, it does, it's silent on other maintenance.
That's right, but it's clear that Stone High, so I was assuming from the express language, that, it says on Stone High, so that's not a green light to go ahead and do other maintenance. Now, taking those streets individually will make us require us to do certain other maintenance. So, I feel like I'm still not convinced that this is a wise financial proposition to not go on the ballot. But when we take streets individually, we're also taking on additional responsibilities that can be quite expensive for the city. Along with a long, expensive process to go ahead and take these streets individually. So I'm not entirely convinced that we should put up this is my question. But I think strategically there are much reasons. All this on here, but I agree with Bill. I don't really feel that I think it's going to be more expensive in the long run to take these streets and take the future maintenance as we have to come.
You're talking like water and sewer and things such as that,
Yeah.
which are all covered by fee structure.
Actually, most of these private ways, we don't have any easements on them for our utilities have anymore. So if we were to do this right, let's say you did a vote and the citizen said, yes, those public ways, we still don't have easements to work on the utilities that we install. So at what point do we actually go out and hire a surveyor and get legal advice to create the utility or the easements that we don't own? By making these public ways, it clears up that ambiguity whatsoever completely. Because we have an order taking that these are our utilities, they're in our way. So that's one of the gray areas of these private ways, that most of them have public utilities in them that we don't have easements for.
King Avenue in my ward has been completely reconstructed by the DPW just a few years ago. Water main, sewer main, gravel, drainage, blacktop, entire street built by the city of Northampton. As far as they knew, they were a city street. So what do? You just tell them, go pound sand?
Well, when we talk about the question, now the question, clearly answer that question, right? I mean, as far as snow removal and snow and ice removal.
Do you have time frame that we have to make a decision about whether or not to proceed so that it's closing the ballot or facing the deadline?
Good question.
Well, there's not a hard and fast deadline. One of the things is we're going to continue with the process we have now. We're going to continue to spend money, and the whole question here is a money question. So if you're going to continue to spend money over the next 6 weeks or so, it'll make putting it on the ballot less and less important because we've spent money to do all of these more and more streets.
So the city council appropriated $22,800 towards this private way adventure that we're on right now. The Board of Public Works is actually really winding down their public process at this point. Like I said, we have one more set of public hearings on 7 different private ways on July 20th, and that really comes with that recommendation of the city council with a vote. And it's really up to the city council what they want to do. I have a standing order from the mayor that we're going down this path of doing this conversion. However, my hands are tied at $23,800. That's where my part of the project just stops.
So you're on money?
Not yet, but the original request was $50,000 and we received $23,800. I've asked for the additional money, I have not seen it come yet.
one of the things that we decided to do was to keep plowing until we move through our process.
We continued through this past winter based on that we would get through this process or at least get the streets to city council for our recommendations, which I think the Board of Public Works is basically done at this point.
So the question is that what happens this fall? What happens this winter with the plowing? If there's a street that we had looked at but hasn't made its way through the city council process?
I think the impression that we all had was that as long as it went through the process and was receiving positive recommendations from planning board and DPW, was that we continue to plow this winter while we go through the legally, the paperwork, the filing of the registry and so on. The issue is that I can't go to city council with a street acceptance recommendation, a positive recommendation, unless I have a survey plan and an order for the council to act on. That's the package that I've been told by our city solicitor that we have to deliver to the city council with a positive recommendation.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, that's postponed. Any other items that we discussed for the end of the meeting?
Yeah, I just have a question for that. I mean, this is new business.
Yes.
I know where you're gonna go. Any movement on the MEMA money for Reservoir Road, not River Road, Reservoir Road?
We sent them some photos they requested about a week and a half ago. I expect that some kind of information will be pending shortly. I just don't have a date.
Okay. But we're still actively pursuing.
Absolutely.
Okay. I got a call from the homeowner.
Joseph?
Yes.
Yes.
The August meeting,
August 12th?
August 12th, I did not get here August 12th. Here, any other day in August, but can't be here on the 12th.
I'm too sure that people will
So
be.
can we move that meeting, the August 12th meeting?
Does this group want a preview of what we're working on as far as this stormwater?
It would be great, in which case, probably later in August, would be better. So I guess it's the 19th, the 19th?
Yep.
Also, I took the liberty of offering to, that the Board of Public Works would hold a public hearing about the stormwater proposal that we're moving, that we're advancing. That we would hold a public hearing after Labor Day. Just giving the public a first look at what sort of, what this package looks like moving forward before you've even touched it.
I think as much public input as we do it along the way, the better.
And I like your idea of placeholders. That's a perfect way to do it. I think all too often, if we're done and we have a public hearing, people are frustrated that it feels like, well, the cake's been baked.
So move. Aye.
Aye.
Did we pick a date
August
for?
19th?
Thank you.